I'm very pleased to introduce the 2014 COAS Spring Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Elaine Blakemore. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from Northern Illinois University in 1978. She taught for several years at the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire before joining the psychology department here at IPFW in 1986. She has taught courses in child psychology, gender development, psychology of women, amongst others. And she served as chair of the psychology department for 13 years. She's been associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences for 5 years, and now she's interim dean of the college. Elaine has received numerous awards and honors for her research, teaching, and service. These include being selected as the IPFW featured faculty for her research. She's a member of the IU Faculty Colloquium for Excellence in Teaching. She received the IPFW Sigma Xi College Science Teacher of the Year Award, the COAS Downs Hollander Service Award, YWCA Women of Achievement Award, and the first ever presidential citation from the Midwestern Psychological Association. Throughout her research career, Dr. Blakemore has focused on questions related to young children's development of ideas about gender. That is, ideas about how boys and girls should act, what toys they should play with, and how parents' attitudes about gender might affect their children's attitudes. Her work has had significant impact on the field. One of her biggest accomplishments is a book that she wrote with 2 co-authors, a very highly regarded book on gender development. And it's perhaps the only book of its type that integrates research findings on biological, social, and cognitive factors that affect gender development. In addition to the book, she's published more than 20 articles and book chapters and given more than 40 presentations on topics related to gender and gender development. And her work has been cited very widely by other scholars. It's been cited over 650 times. And you can find references to her work in textbooks on developmental psychology and psychology of gender. Dr. Blakemore's research also has attracted the interest of popular media. She's been interviewed several times by Parents Magazine, and she was interviewed for the popular book Cinderella Ate My Daughter by best-selling author Peggy Orenstein. Her work also has attracted many IPFW students to work in her lab, where she's closely mentored them as assistants in her research and on their own projects. It's easy to see why her work has attracted so much attention. Ideas about gender shape so much of our lives, and while we may take these ideas for granted, Dr. Blakemore has sought to understand where they come from. As you can imagine, this is not an easy task when you're working with very young people who can't tell us directly what they're thinking. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Blakemore to tell us about her research. And I am going to present you with this lovely award. Hang wherever you want.
Okay. My voice is going kind of messy, so if that's a problem, you'll have to forgive me. I want to start by thanking a bunch of people. I'll do it as quickly as I can. Many of my departmental colleagues, I appreciate the support for my research over the years. I have worked on research with Craig Hill, Carol Lawton, and Lisa Vartanian, so I thank them in particular. Lynn Libben and Sherry Berenbaum are the co-authors of my gender development book, and I have particular thanks to them. With reference to this talk, but my work in general, many of my colleagues have young children, or they might not be so young anymore, but they were at the time that they lent me their children to test them or to videotape them, and so you'll see some of those pictures today. Those are my colleagues' children's names. I have a few videos that I'll be showing today, and I should thank the people who helped put those videos together, particularly Tom, Neil, and Margaret Blakemore. And I want to thank the COAS office staff who put all these talks together in terms of all of the publicity and the reception that we'll be having afterwards and so on. I do want to thank all the parents and children who have taken part in my research over the years, and I've had also many students working in the lab. My current lab students, Hina, Ashlyn, Liza, and Manal, I think most of them are here. At least some of them are here. So anyway, thanks to all of them. So what I want to do then is I first want to give you an overview of what I intend to talk about today. I want to talk about 3 general things. The first I'm calling the what of gender development. And there's going to be 3 things under the what also, but we'll get there in a minute. I also want to talk about the how or why or reasons for different aspects of gender development. And then I want to talk about my own research, which will be embedded in all of these different topics. So, what for the what? There are 3 things that, as I said, I was going to divide the 3 into 3. The first thing that I want to talk about is gender differences in behavior. These are differences between males and females when you're studying children, differences in children's behavior. Boys might act a particular way and girls might act another way. So that's the first of the 3 what topics that I want to discuss. The second is gender differences in interests. You might think of interests as being part of gender differences in behavior, but they're really different than other behaviors are because they're so overwhelmingly masculine or feminine when you look at interests, whereas most other behaviors have incredible overlap between males and females. And the third thing that I want to talk about with respect to the what of gender development is gender knowledge and attitudes. Young children, obviously, when they're first born, know nothing about gender, and over the first few years of life, they gain a considerable amount of information about it, and so it's that knowledge and eventually attitudes that I also want to talk about. So, starting with gender differences in cognitive and social behaviors. This is, in the study of gender, one of the oldest areas of research on anything related to gender in psychology, differences between the behavior of males and females. I put up here 3 of the first studies that were published in the psychological literature on the topic of behavioral differences between males and females. So you can see that it's been going on for a long time. Some of the other things that we'll be looking at don't have a history that's this long at all. When we talk about gender differences in behavior, in behavioral differences between males and females, we're never talking about, or almost never, talking about something where all males behave one way and all females behave another way. We're talking about overlapping differences, and I'll give you some examples in a minute, but I have 2 sets of overlapping curves up here. The one at the bottom right is the overlap between the distributions of height for adult males and females, and what you can see there is that they're pretty spread apart. On average, males are considerably taller than females. If you're an average height female, it's not very often that you'll come across a male who's shorter than you, for example. Most behaviors are considerably more overlapping than the distributions for height. But even if you think about height, you can see that not all men are a certain height and not all women are another, and that individuals vary and are different. But much behavior is going to be more like the set of overlapping curves on the top left, and in fact maybe even closer together than that. So, I want to find out where I actually am. Okay, great. You may have heard, for example, I'm just going to go through a few examples before we go to my research. You may have heard that males have better spatial skills than females do. You may not be aware that that's so even when measured in infancy. Even infant males can detect differences in spatial arrangements better than infant females can. You may not have heard to the same degree, and I am trying here to balance what males are better at with what females are better at. You may not be aware that females are better at decoding facial expressions of emotion on other people, even as infants. And so again, this is an example of gender differences in behavior. You may have heard that males on average have higher scores on the math portion of the scholastic aptitude tests. Perhaps you've also heard that the more recent, since 2006, critical writing test, which I think is sort of ironic because that's the one that they just decided to dump. But nevertheless, you may also be aware that on average females have better scores on the critical writing test of the SAT. So you're looking at sort of small average differences in behaviors. So those are cognitive behaviors. This is kind of an outrageous slide on social behaviors, but I think it makes the point. You may also have heard that males are more likely to be aggressive at all ages that it's measured. By aggression, we're talking about behavior intended to hurt or harm other people. You may have heard that males do engage in more risk-taking, for example, that at least starting in adolescence, but not in childhood. Females have higher rates of depression. So there are some examples of social gender differences. My research on gender differences in behavior always focused on gender differences in interests and interactions with infants. The first study that I published in this area of gender differences in interactions with infants was in 1981, and the last one that I published was in 1998. This overlapped with my early years at IPFW, and you might say, at least I might say, that it was this area of research that got me tenure because it overlapped it with my probationary period at IPFW. So next thing that I want to look at is gender differences in interests. From a behavioral standpoint, this is one of the largest and most notable differences between males and females, and in childhood in particular. You notice it. There are a couple of different ways that psychologists can measure gender differences in interests in children. And a lot of what you focus on in children is toys and activities, what they're interested in playing with or doing. You can have parents or teachers complete rating scales. You can ask children themselves what they're interested in, or you can observe them. Interestingly, these things are not always in agreement, but what I'm going to do is focus on sort of scales that ask children themselves what they're interested in. Sorry about that. What I'm going to use as an example here is something called the Preschool Occupations, Activities, and Traits Scale. It has some attitudinal measures, but it also has some interest measures. And basically, you show children a single picture of an object, a toy, or an activity that you might engage in, and you ask them how interested they would be in doing that. And this is the scale that the POT uses. This says that you show and we'll see this in the next coming video, you ask them, we're going to show you some pictures, and if you would not like to do it at all, point to this one. If you would like to do it a little bit or some, point to this one. If you would really like to do it, point to this one. And so we'll start with that video.
And if you decide you would really like to do something, you should point to that picture, okay? And if you would like to do it just a little bit, point to that one. And if you would not like to do it at all, point to that one, okay? So these are things that you might do, well, and we're going to have a practice one first. How much would you like to eat ice cream? Not at all, a little bit, or a lot. Okay, that's the practice one. Now I'll ask you about things you might want to be when you grow up, okay? And if you don't know what they are, you can ask me and I'll tell you. All right?
But it better be like something like a big cat scientist, because I love big cats.
Okay.
And they're endangered, though.
Well, I don't know that we have that question, but
Okay.
if you don't like them, you can just say, I don't want to be that. Okay? So how would you like to be a cheerleader when you grow up? Okay, that's great.
Actually, a lot.
A lot? Okay.
Yeah.
That helps. How much would you like to be a cook in a restaurant? Okay. You're doing well. How much would you like to be a ballet dancer? Somebody who dances, you know what a ballet dancer is, you betcha. Okay, how much would you like to be an astronaut? Okay. How much would you like to be a truck driver? Okay.
Okay, so I want to then, the POTE is a measure that is published and people can use, and I'm using it in my current research, but what I want to do now is talk about some of my own research that measured infants. And this is a really old study, and I'm choosing this one for a couple of reasons, because I want to use it again later, and because in this study we measured interest in 2-year-olds. And there's not a lot of research that measures interest in 2-year-olds with this kind of measure, because it's really hard to do, and they're not always cooperative, and sometimes they can't answer the questions that you're asking them, and you'll see that in a little bit. The study that I did was not like the POTE. In the POTE, you have a single item and you pick yes or no or maybe a little bit. This way of measuring it, and a lot of people have done it the way that I did, involves pick the one you like the best. So when you're doing that with gender stereotyped items, you're forcing them to look for the gendered item as a choice. So which one of these two would you like the best? In this study, there were 60 children, 10 boys and 10 girls, aged 2, 4, and 6, 24 pairs of pictures of toys. But each of the feminine toys was used twice, paired with 2 different masculine toys, and same for each of the masculine toys, and everything was counterbalanced to the left and right and all of that the way that, you know, you're supposed to do. It was done. So they were asked, which one do you like the best? With 24 pictures of toys, if you picked all 20, if you're a girl, and you picked all 24 of the girls' toys as the one you like best, you're going to have a score of 24 in this measure. If you pick randomly, half the boys and half the girls, you're going to have a score of 12. So 12 is just half the time I picked a boy's toy, half the time I picked a girl's toy. So that would be the 12 out of 24. So what you see here in this graph is the results from that study, and you should notice a couple of different things. The pink line is girls, and what you should be able to see is at age of 2, girls had basically random toy preferences. They were picking, it was 11.8 or something like that out of 24 feminine toys. By 4, considerably higher, it was maybe about 17 out of 24, and by 6, they're near the top of the scale. And for boys, what you see is that they're high across the board. There's a little bit of an age effect, but it wasn't a statistically significant age effect. We're going to come back to this later, but I want to say a couple of things about it. Something different is going on with boys than is going on with girls. This finding has been replicated by other people, and so that's one of the things that I want you to know about it. The other is, by the time kids are 5 or 6, their preferences are so gendered that it's hard to find a lot of variance in what they prefer. It depends on how you measure it. If you measure it the way the POTE does, with a not forced choice, you get a little bit more flexibility in what kids choose, but you find overwhelmingly gendered preferences by that age. Now I'm going to switch gears again with the what question and go to gender cognitions. There's two overview things that I want to look at in gender cognitions, and the first is knowledge about gender itself. Newborn babies do not know anything about gender. They don't know that there are boys and girls. They don't know they are boys and girls, let alone knowing whose toys are for boys and girls. They don't know anything about gender. So the question developmental researchers want to know is, when do they know something about gender, and when they do, what does it do after that? So we find that children are reliably able to answer the question, what are you, a boy or a girl, by about the age of 2.5. Not by 2, but somewhere between 2 and 30 months of age. But even then, they do not realize, as perhaps all of you do, that gender is a core aspect of your identity that isn't really very changeable. I mean, we all know that there are transgendered individuals, but a 2-year-old child obviously doesn't know that. But for most people, gender is a core aspect of identity and isn't easily changeable. And children don't know that at all. They may think that, they may know, if you ask them a question, are you a boy or a girl, they may be able to answer it. They don't really understand that that is what that depends on, and that it's not easily changeable. And here we have another one. So what we're asking here is a question of what will you be when you grow up, and then if such and such happened, would you still be a girl?
When you grow up, will you be a mother or a father?
Mother.
If you played the games that boys usually play, would then you really be a boy or really be a girl?
Girl.
A girl. And do you know why you'd really be a girl?
Because it doesn't matter what you play with, you'll still be whatever you are.
Okay.
Okay, now she says, doesn't matter what you play, you'll still be what you are. Younger children don't typically say that.
If you went in the other room and put on clothes like this, would you then really be a boy or really be a girl?
Boy.
You would be a boy? Do you know why?
Because girls don't wear clothes like that.
Okay.
So a minute ago, she says, it doesn't matter what you do, you're a girl no matter what. And then you say, if you wore these clothes, what would you be? Suddenly, I'd be a boy because girls don't wear clothes like that. So clothes are really tough for kids to comprehend about whether or not gender has remained stable, for example. Okay, as soon as kids know that there are males and females, they begin to acquire knowledge about gender norms. And this becomes, I think, really significant in the long run, because that once they acquire knowledge about those norms, then they use that knowledge, and we'll look at that in a little bit. So soon after kids know that there are boys and girls, they start to come to comprehend that certain things are associated with gender, and toys are among the first things that they learn are associated with gender, as well as clothing. Occupations related to adults a bit later than that. Personality characteristics, play styles, and so on later than that. But ultimately, knowledge pretty much is its ceiling for everybody. So we have a slide here as a study that I did, and I think it was published in about 2003, in which there are 5 age groups: younger preschoolers from 3 to 4.5, older preschoolers from 4.5 to 6, then 1st, 3rd, and 5th graders. Simply asking a question, we'll see another video clip in a minute, who usually wears clothes like this, and a picture of traditionally masculine clothes, or who usually plays with G.I. Joes, or who usually plays with Barbies, or that sort of question. And what you should be able to see on this slide is that by the middle of elementary school, everybody's at ceiling. Everybody knows these norms. And in the preschool to early elementary period, the different ones are learned at different rates, and so some are learned earlier than others. The next question that you might want to ask then as a gender cognition is, once you know what the norms are, once you know that certain kinds of clothing, for example, is associated with girls, do you come to believe that it ought to be? Is this an obligatory aspect of behavior? So what we're going to look at in the next little clip is 3 aspects of gender cognitions, and ultimately it's probably attitudes that are going to matter the most, because pretty much everybody learns the associations. So in this study, there were 3 kinds of questions: knowledge questions. The second kind I'm talking about, I'm calling flexibility questions, and then the third I'm calling attitude questions. Is it a good idea? And you can see what I call my kitty Likert scale down there, where you've all seen Likert scales where like strongly agree to strongly disagree or whatever.
What I'm going to do is explain these faces here. So there'll be some questions that I'll use these faces for, and some I won't. all right?
All right.
But when I use them, this one means that something is very bad. This means it's a little bad. This means it doesn't matter. This means it's good. And this means it's very good. Okay, you get that? Okay, that's great. So I am going to start by asking you some questions about who does certain things, and we'll just go through the questions. And if you have questions, let me know, or if you don't understand, just ask me to explain it, okay?
All right.
All right, so we're going to start with this picture of Barbies, okay? Who usually plays with Barbies, boys or girls?
Usually girls do, but not all girls do.
Okay, but usually girls. Can boys also play with Barbies?
Yes.
Okay. And now we're going to use a picture. Can you point to the one that you think is what it's like if boys play with Barbies? If it was, you know what they mean? Okay.
Probably doesn't matter.
Okay.
As I said before, pretty much all children learn gender-related knowledge. When you get to attitudes like whether or not something is acceptable, this is where you find more individual differences, where some children think it's absolutely acceptable and others think it's not. But it also depends considerably on the norm and to some extent on age. So on this graph, you should be able to see way over on the left-hand side on the 5-point scale, with 1, the lower scores being not acceptable at all and the higher scores being completely acceptable, that it's hard to find children who think that it's acceptable for boys to go around in girls' clothing. That's the one that's really low, and I'm sure you can see that there on the slide on the left-hand side. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have things like toys, like a toy kitchen. Is it okay for boys to play with a toy kitchen? You can see that decreases a little bit as children grow older, but still, the majority of kids think that that's pretty much all right, at least when they're especially young. So 2 things you notice here. It's nowhere near as high as knowledge, and there are some age effects and some individual differences. Okay, so conclusions about what? There are a number of gender differences in behavior, like interactions with infants and spatial skills or whatever, between males and females. Most of those differences are small to moderate. There's a lot of similarity between males and females as well, but for the moment we're talking about differences. Gender differences in interests are considerably larger than gender differences in behavior are, and by the time kids are in the late preschool period, they're really noticeable gender differences in interests. And children learn about gender norms fairly easily, and once they learn them, they develop views about enforcing them. So that's the what. Now I'm going to switch to how and why. And I'm starting with biology. First, let me say that I have not done any primary research on the biology of sex and gender differences. Our book has a couple of very strong chapters on the biology of gender. However, I didn't write them. Sherry Barenbaum wrote them, so I can't take that much credit for them. I did read them. I read them while they were being written. I also have a couple of recent review articles on the topic of biological influences and gender differences in behavior, and I'm bringing this up so that I can establish that I do have some credentials for talking about biological effects on gender, but if you were to ask me complicated questions about them, I might not be able to answer. Okay. There are 3 factors that we're concerned about when we are interested in biological effects on gender differences in behavior: genes, hormones, and the brain. And I would say it's really not fair to look at them as 3 different factors because they're integrally tied together. The genetic factors influence what hormones are secreted, which influences the development of the brain, and so on. There are some people who are looking at the direct role of genes. This is not a serious slide. This is a joke. I don't know whether you can read it or not. but it was developed by Jane Gitcher, who is a neuroscientist, and it was published in Science some years ago as genes on the Y chromosome, such as the gene for channel flipping, addiction to death and destruction movies, and so on. So I will say there are some people looking at the direct role of genes, but for the most part, when you look at biological influences on behavior, you're looking at the effects of hormones. And there are two general kinds of effects of hormones. One is called organizing effects. These are effects that occur early in development. Usually in humans, we're talking about prenatal effects. And those effects then permanently change both the body and the developing brain. And when you're a behavioral scientist, you're interested in whether those effects have an influence on behavior. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Developmental psychologists are, to some extent, much more interested in organizing effects than they are in the second kind of hormone effect, which is activating effects that might affect behavior while the hormone is circulating in the blood, usually after puberty. So those are the two general effects. Some summary information about organizing effects. During prenatal life, males are exposed to considerably higher levels of androgens than females are. And I realize I'm going over this quickly, but it's fine. We can go over it quickly. You're not going to be tested over it. There's also a considerable amount in many different species of experimental animal research manipulating early hormone exposure in genetically male and female animals and looking for effects on behavior, and considerable amount of research that shows effects on behavior. In animals, the kind of behavior that are looked at, in particular, rough and tumble play, aggression, sexual behavior, and to some extent spatial skills. So what about in humans? You obviously cannot give pregnant women large amounts of androgens and look to see whether their children, their daughters in particular, are affected by that for reasons that should be obvious to you. So there are two things that people can do in humans. The second is more common than the first. The first is to find a way to measure circulating levels of androgens in normally developing fetuses. This has only been done a couple of times. I'm going to show you a slide in the next slide that looks at it. How it was done in this particular study that I'm going to show you is that these were mothers. This is a large study done in the United Kingdom by a team of researchers who are largely interested in prenatal effects on autism. But what they did basically is take samples during amniocentesis of levels of circulating androgens when the mothers were undergoing amniocentesis for a medically relevant reason. They weren't undergoing amniocentesis for the purposes of the research. But then the amniotic fluid was collected and saved, and you could look at the levels of circulating androgens in normally developing children. The other way that this research is done, and this is a lot more common, and Sherry Birnbaum, my co-author on the book and those other two articles that I talked about, is one of the world's experts on doing research on congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is a condition in which, it's a genetic condition in which the adrenal glands malfunction prenatally and bathe the developing baby in high levels of androgens. That's probably all you need to know. For boys, the levels of androgens are higher than normal for boys, but there's probably some kind of ceiling effect for prenatal androgens. For girls, they're way higher than what girls would normally be exposed to prenatally. So you can use this as an experimental model to look at the effects of biology on gender-related behavior. Here's the first one. This is two graphs, one of girls, one of boys. The y-axis shows the PSAI score. The PSAI is also a measure that I'm using. It's the Preschool Activities Inventory. It's a parent-completed measure of gender-related personality characteristics and interests in children, and it can be used with children past the preschool period with an age-corrected score. And basically, the higher the score, the more masculine the interests and traits. And so what you see here is the higher, on the left-hand graph of girls, the higher their exposure to prenatal androgens from this one-time amniocentesis measure, the higher their score in the PSAI, which means the more masculine their interests as children. These are normally developing babies, not children who had any kind of abnormality like CAH. And you see the same thing for boys. The graph is not as steep, but within these normally developing boys, these kids were between 6 and 10 years of age at the time. So the amniocentesis had been done years before, and the amniotic fluid was saved and then measured later, and the behavior was measured at that time. So you just see basically a relationship between prenatal androgen and gender behavior in childhood. CAH, this is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the girls get lots of androgens prenatally. There are many, many studies on CAH girls, and these are the sorts of things that they measure: toy play, adolescent activities, friend preferences, interest in babies. There's a bunch of different things that are measured in CAH, spatial skills, etc. This first slide looks at the left-hand side are, I don't know that I would always call these boys' toys, but traditionally masculine toys, vehicles, and the sort of toys that boys typically would have. What you have on that side of the graph is control females, CAH females, those are the first two bars, control male, CAH males. And who are the control females? For the most part, the control females in most of the newer research on CAH are the sisters and sometimes female cousins of the girls who have CAH, if they don't happen to have sisters. So they're growing up at least ideally in the same family. And what you see is that the CAH girls are much more interested in traditional boys' toys than their sisters are. And on the right-hand side, these are traditional girls or feminine toys. And here we have the control females as the black first bar. The sisters are way more interested in girls' toys than the CAH girls are. That's one example. The next one, this bar goes out for how big the difference is. And so you see childhood play, adolescent activities. These are interests that are gendered that adolescents might be interested in. Playmate preference, aggression, spatial ability, and so on. And basically you see, and this is just a girl's slide, differences between girls exposed to androgen prenatally and their sisters being more masculine. So I hope I've convinced you that there is evidence that biological factors influence gender differences in behavior. I was nominated to do this talk by the Women's Studies Executive Committee, and there's often some discomfort among feminists in particular with biological explanations for gender differences, and I want to one of the articles that I showed you earlier was an anniversary article in the journal Sex Roles that we wrote on the biological factors that influence gender. One of my jobs in that article was to determine why people would be uncomfortable with this kind of research. And there are a lot of reasons people might be uncomfortable with it, but there's been a long-standing history of using biological factors to denigrate the abilities of women. You may have noticed when I talked about cognitive differences between males and females, I tried to give examples of things that females were good at just as often as I gave examples of things that males are good at. But that hasn't been the history. So we have this 1887 quote in which you can clearly see somebody's thinking that women's skill and abilities are lower than those of males. This has not gone away. Here's Larry Summers. And many of you may remember his quote about women can't do science because of these intrinsic factors implying biology. From my perspective, the political uses of research are different than the research findings themselves, and I'm absolutely convinced that there's evidence that some of the differences between males and females have a biological origin. that doesn't mean that that's the only factor, and having an influence isn't the same thing as being the only cause. And so let's move on away from biology to relationships between gender, cognitions, behaviors, and interests. Children use gender knowledge. Children prefer gender stereotyped toys once they know that they're stereotyped. If you label neutral objects as being for boys and girls, then the boys will tell you they like the one that you just labeled as being for boys. There's research showing that boys especially prefer boys' toys that are old, dirty, and broken over brand new girls' toys. So children use this information to make choices about themselves. There's something that we call, laughingly, in gender development research called the hot potato effect. This comes from a gender researcher, Bruce Carter, who once was just observing kids and noticed this little boy playing with a toy car that had a driver with a helmet on, and when the helmet fell off, the driver appeared to have long, flowing hair, and the boy dropped the car like a hot potato. So that's just an example of children clearly do use gender knowledge. The next thing that I want to do then is go back to some of my research, and we looked at this study earlier where the 2-year-old boys preferred boys' toys and the 2-year-old girls did not, but everybody did by age 6. In this study, we also measured knowledge about toys. We tried to do it in a bunch of different possible ways, and what we ended up doing is taking 12 pictures of toys and putting the toys in front of the kid and putting 2 toys together in front of the child and say, show me the one that's for boys. Show me the one that's for girls. And by the time kids are 6, and there were 20 toys that we used in this measure, by the time kids are 6, they know 100% the answer to this question. 2-year-olds cannot answer this question. That's one 2-year-old. There's no difference between boys and girls, but 2-year-olds cannot answer that question. No matter how you try to ask it, 2-year-olds have no idea what you're talking about. 4-year-olds are pretty good. And so if you look back to the preference data, you find that girls' preferences are consistent with their knowledge. That is, the more they come to learn that toys are for girls, the more they come to say they like them. So what I then did was study 3-year-old girls between the 2 and 4-year-olds. And I divided, I think there were 20 girls, maybe there were 30. In any case, there was this relatively small number of girls in the study. And what I did is I divided my preference task in half, and I used half of it for knowledge, point to the one that's for boys, point to the one that's for girls. And I changed the order of the task. Half the kids had preference measured first, point to the one you like, and then half the kids had knowledge measured first. And so you're taking children who spontaneously are not necessarily preferring gender-typical toys, but when you bring knowledge to the fore first, then they do. So this was a score out of 12. And for the children who had their preference, these are only girls, measured first, their score was around 6, or maybe a little higher, of the female toy. But for the girls who I first asked, show me the one for girls, show me the one for boys, then I asked, tell me what one you like, suddenly they were able to use the information. So we have plenty of evidence that older children use it all the time, but this is evidence that if you bring children's attention to it by a certain developmental level, they can start to use it, even though they don't normally use it. Okay? That's one of the reasons why I wanted to use that study before, partly because you've got these little tiny kids, and partly because of the effect showing that knowledge does, in fact, have an impact on what people prefer to do. So last of the factors that might influence gender-related behavior is socialization. And I want to talk a little bit about my toy research as a socialization influence. Toys this research is the research that I get phone calls about all the time, that Carol mentioned in terms of the popular press media are always interested in the toy research. Children spend a lot of time when they're young playing with toys. You can learn certain things about yourself and your skills by playing with toys. Toys are incredibly marketed to boys and girls. If you don't believe that, then just go to a toy store and look at even Target, or Toys R Us is a toy store, and look and see how toys are marketed to boys and girls. So in this study, what we wanted to do is we looked at hundreds of different toys, and we categorized them in a variety of ways. And after all of that, okay, let me back up and say what's on the slide. Toys are important because children spend a lot of time playing with them, and you learn certain things by playing with certain kinds of toys. You learn different things if you play with a makeup kit than you learn if you play with a gun. And so after we categorized the different toys, we divided them into, or found that we were able to divide them into 5 different categories: strongly feminine toys, moderately feminine toys, neutral toys, moderately masculine toys, and strongly masculine toys. And then in a second study, we found out what they were like. And this is what they were like. Strongly feminine toys, the most strongly feminine toys that you can find are about what you look like. They're about physical appearance. You can buy makeup kits, little plastic high heels, Barbie doll heads, etc. These were rated on I don't know, it was maybe 20 different scales. A lot of the scales that we were having them rated on were, does it stimulate educational ability? Does it stimulate cognitive skill? Would you learn spatial skills from this? Etc. And strongly feminine toys are rated as consistently being not associated with any of those positive things. What they're basically about is predominantly appearance. Then the next category are both moderately and strongly. You can put into that category nurturance and domestic skill. So with feminine toys, you can imagine ironing. So that's like do I have an iron there? I don't, but vacuuming, you can imagine vacuuming. We could not find anything that was particularly characteristic about moderately feminine toys above and beyond the ones that were also associated with that middle category. Strongly masculine toys, where strongly feminine toys are about appearance, strongly masculine toys are about killing people. They're about violence, aggression, military toys, WW now. What is it now? Is it WWE now, or has it got a new name? So you can take wrestling figures and bang them together, and you can get weapons and all of that sort of things. You can do exciting, adventuresome things. And then the category of strongly and moderately together overlap on things moving on their own, being exciting, sustaining attention, and so on. Probably among the best toys for stimulating children's intellectual, cognitive, and educational development are the overlap between moderately masculine and neutral toys. Things like science kits, gears, weather kits that help you not control the weather, but predict the weather. So moderately masculine and neutral toys are these sort of educationally stimulating kinds of toys, as to some extent are neutral toys. So what I would say about socialization with respect to toys is that toy play has an impact on children's development, and there are a number of aspects of both strongly feminine and strongly masculine toys that are undesirable in terms of developmental outcomes. Once children know that toys are for boys and for girls, they want them in spite of what you decide you want to give them. And that's back to that issue of children shaping their own interests and development. But you couldn't do that if there wasn't information out there in the culture to learn. You couldn't assume that Barbies were for girls unless the message is clearly providing that information for children to be able to learn. Okay, I told people at the beginning that this was going to be too long, so what I'm going to do is skip through the parts that I intended to skip through if it got too long, and we'll talk about one final thing. So toys are a form of socialization, families are a form of socialization. And I want to go to this. Okay. When I was studying gender differences in interactions with babies, I did a variety of different studies trying to look at reasons for why girls were so much more interested in interacting with babies than boys were. And among the things we looked at was family socialization factors. In this particular study, we were looking at families with feminist attitudes about children compared to families with relatively traditional attitudes about children. In this study, the parents, and we got some reliability coding done as well, did the observations of their children with unfamiliar infants. We gave them instructions, go out in the world and find, if you happen to come across a baby in the dentist's office or whatever that you don't know, this baby is not a family member or whatever, record your child's interest in that baby. And what we looked at is the difference between boys and girls' interest in babies from these two different kinds of families. And what you should be able to see here is that the difference is in the boys. The pink and blue bars, you'll have to forgive that, are the boys and girls from traditional families in which, like everybody else had found, and not a lot of people have done baby research, but there's a handful of groups, and pretty much they consistently found, like I did, that girls were more interested in interacting with babies than boys were. But the green and yellow bars are the boys and girls from the more non-traditional families. And the big difference, there's a slightly lower degree of interest on the part of girls than in traditional families, but it's not significant. The big difference is that the boys from the more liberal family backgrounds were more interested in babies than boys from the more traditional backgrounds, and basically showing the same degree of interest in interacting with babies as girls did. So, I want to thank Craig Hill for all his work with me on this gender socialization scale. We developed a scale with a series of like 4 or 5 studies and published it in 2008, looking at the differences between, or creating a scale to characterize families in their interest about gender-related behaviors in their own children. And up to that point, if you wanted, like the study we just looked at with the babies, if you wanted to characterize families as liberal or conservative about gender and then study them with their children, you had to use a measure, because these were the only measures that were around, about gender-related attitudes about adults. And so we developed this measure that can be used to find out what different families think about gender-related behavior in their own children, and then look to see how those children are different. And that is the work that I've been doing now for the last, I'm going to skip over the sample items, for the last, ever since 2008, looking at families with different kinds of attitudes about gender in general and gender in their children, and measuring their children's gender-related knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. And it's actually been really interesting but terribly time-consuming, because it's been very, very hard to get both parents and children willing to take part in a study on this topic. But I'm going to show you a very recent graph. Besides families being liberal and conservative, families are configured differently. And this was a comparison of families with only girls or only boys, and families who have both boys and girls. So the first thing that you're looking at here is mothers' ratings of the desirability of their children playing with traditionally feminine toys, which is one of the scales in the measure that Craig and I developed. And what you should see is that the blue bars are families that only have girls or only have boys. And the difference between how positive mothers feel about daughters playing with feminine toys and sons playing with feminine toys is considerably larger than when they have children of both genders, which are the two pink bars. So maternal attitudes differ depending on whether you have sons and daughters in the family. And in the next slide, so do the children. And this is, I think, the most interesting part of it. The PSAI is that measure that I talked about before that was used in the hormonal amniocentesis study. It's been used by a lot of people, more in the United Kingdom than in this country. But what you can see here is the same thing, that the difference that boys in families with no sisters are considerably higher on the masculine end of the scale than boys who have sisters, and vice versa for girls who have brothers. But to me, the interesting part is, and that's also tied to what their parents think. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. And we're kind of late, so if you have a couple of questions, I'd be happy to answer one or two, but you know, there's an open bar in the other room. Jeannie's asking one, and then Peter had his hand up too. Yes, Jeannie.
I don't know if there's any research, or what would your thoughts be about socialization, gender role socialization among children being raised in same-sex parental households?
There's lots of research on that topic.
And
what it shows is that on many measures, children raised by most of the research is in lesbian families because, as you're, I think, well aware, finding representative samples of children being raised by two gay fathers is considerably more difficult. On many measures, there's very little difference between children in being raised in gay and lesbian families compared to children being raised by heterosexuals, except on measures of gender. And children raised by lesbian mothers in particular are typically more accepting of a variety of gender-related, non-normative, if you like, behaviors than children raised in heterosexual families. But I think there are also heterosexual families who would be equally accepting. But did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'm also wondering if the findings would be different if we were able to get a representative sample of female households.
I actually sent you one the other day. There was a new study that just came out in child development looking at, you need to read your email, Jeannie. There's a study that just came out in child development looking at gay male fathers and children in those families. There's and I do not remember, honestly, whether it had a measure of gender. It certainly had measures of adjustment and all of that sort of stuff, but I don't know whether it had a gender measure. It might have. Do you remember, Craig?
I actually didn't read it, and I don't remember about a measure of gender either.
Yeah. One of the problems in that study was that the gay men fathers, there were three groups in that study, a group of children being raised by lesbian mothers, a group of children being raised by gay fathers, and a group of children in heterosexual families. And the gay fathers in particular had way disproportionately male children. There were very few female children in those families, so it's going to be really hard to study something like this unless you have a greater balance. And obviously it's not randomly assigned. So they choose the gender of the children they adopt to some extent, I think.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Carl Drummond. Until last month, I was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And Elaine was my colleague and very able associate dean, and now she's the interim dean. But prior to that fateful transition, for which I'm afraid she won't talk to me.
We're still speaking.
Yeah, mainly by email. And so prior to that, I was in regular communication with the executive committee of the College of the Arts and Sciences. And last semester, they, when this planning for this event came up, there was a conversation, and they voted unanimously to offer to Elaine the second of the Lowell Beinecke medals.
Oh my gosh.
So.
And thank you to the executive committee, and now we can all go have a snack.
Well, not everybody here may not know exactly what the Lowell Beinecke Medal is.
Sorry.
It is, I guess you would say, the highest distinction of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it represents, it is awarded to those people who have achieved outstanding contributions in all three areas of faculty work, scholarship, teaching, and service, and I can think of nobody more worthy than Elaine.
Thank you very much.
I think we have something better than that.